That's interesting. I had tried other programs, internet programs and so forth. Attorneys are slow adopters of technology. I think I do better than most, but we are slow adopters of technology. I can tell you that outside of my office for many years was a typewriter. And again, I've only been practicing for 16 years, but that typewriter is still here somewhere. It's just not right outside my office. So I started to explore options online. I'm not a huge social media person. I don't do Facebook. I don't do that. And what I found is on most of the programs that you get involved with, your information's out there and you start getting a lot of cold calls. And there's a concept of you got to cast a wide net if you're going to catch any good fish. Well, the problem is when you're doing those other kinds of platforms and your information's out there and somebody texts you or emails you something about a case that there is no way anyone on earth thought would be in your wheelhouse, you've got to respond. If you don't respond, you're subject to getting a bad review, getting a Google review, a client seeming to think that you're ignoring, nasty grams. You get cold calls all the time. It was a problem. And the juice just wasn't, as they say, worth the squeeze. With LegalMatch, I found that you're protected from that. So effectively, they don't know who I am. They don't have my contact information. Nobody's going to give me a bad review or say that I'm ignoring them. Instead, I have a platform where I can look at what the actual case is, what the general case looks like, and I can make an educated decision about, all right, this one seems like it may have legs. The other 10 don't, but this one seems like I'd be interested in pursuing at least a little bit. And so it gives me the ability to filter that other platforms didn't provide. From a feature perspective, again, it's I'm in control. So it's not somebody sending me an email that I immediately have to drop what I'm doing to respond in order to at least avoid a bad review. And so it gives me the ability where there's effectively a dashboard that tells you when you have new cases. You get emails and notifications when a new case in your particular area is posted. You can go in, you can review it. And then what ultimately happens is you have, well, first off, the clients are all kind of preconditioned to know that there's going to be a cost. This is not a charity operation. This is not free legal advice. So they're preconditioned by having to check how they intend to make a payment. Whether that's how they do it or not, they're preconditioned to the concept that they have to likely make a payment if they're going to engage your services. But then I have the ability to kind of, when I have time and when I feel like it's a good opportunity to kind of scroll through, all right, what are the cases that might be out there? Is it something where the client has indicated that this is a case that just doesn't justify an attorney's services, or at least my services? Is it something that is interesting, some kind of a unique real estate related or business related case? And then again, I have the ability to pre-prepare a reply, so I don't have to sit there and go through the whole initiating email conversation. Two, you don't have to worry about the concept of, wait a second, is this me initially contacting a client? Because they're actually contacting you. And so what you're doing is responding to an inquiry that they made. And then three, it gives you that ability to not have to, for every good one or potential case, you don't have to deal with the other 10 or 15 other cases that are just going to kind of slowly but surely suck time out of your day and make you regret signing up for the program. Well, here's the short version of it. I got involved with LegalMatch at the beginning of, I believe it was beginning of 2020. And originally when I was in there, I had focused on, when I was coming up, I started practicing after about 3 years. We had the recession here in Arizona. And that means just by default, I did a lot of commercial landlord-tenant work. And so when I first signed up, I signed up to say, let's do landlord-tenant work. Well, you can imagine if you were doing landlord-tenant work and you were on the internet at the beginning of 2020, right before COVID started, immediately after that, there's an explosion of people who have questions about landlord-tenant, whether it be commercial or residential. And so the amount of potential cases is just huge out there. And from my perspective, again, you cast that wide net, but here it's a little bit more intentional of a casting of that net. And you have the ability to kind of cherry pick a little bit of what you're casting for. Those cases, not all of them are huge cases. I don't want to give any misleading thought here. They're not all going to be huge cases. But my original thought was, all right, I need cases that justify the expense of the LegalMatch program. And so you grab a couple of them and pretty quickly the program pays for itself. And then after that, what you find is there's a lot of cases that if you want, you can quickly get in there and quickly set up phone calls and quickly set up matters. And so for somebody who's fairly busy and has been fairly busy for a while, it's a good safety net to be able to say, listen, I might not get to LegalMatch for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, just because I'm too busy working on other matters. But when you have a lull, you can always go there. And that's nice as somebody who never knows really where that next case is going to come from. It's nice to have that safety net. As I indicated just a moment ago, I was originally signed up as somebody who worked in real estate and landlord tenant. Well, I still do that. I also have some business dispute components built in as well. But when you were listed as landlord tenant, it meant that there are a ton of people, obviously, usually on the tenant side, but there were quite a few people on the landlord side who just simply had no real concept of what any of the COVID restrictions or the eviction moratoriums or the foreclosure moratoriums, no concept of what any of that was doing. And so what I found is there's a giant network of people out there who I otherwise would have had no contact with. They don't know anybody who knows anybody who knows anybody who knows my firm. And so what it does is it allows them to go to a public place to kind of post these kinds of questions and information. And what you find is, particularly during that time, very similar types of questions. So it's not as though you have to sit there and independently do research on each particular case. You start having similar conversations with these individuals and these prospective clients. And by definition, because you're doing that regularly, the phone calls become simpler. The initial contacts become quicker. You're more efficient with what you're bringing in and what you're not bringing in. And so what I found is, and by the way, during COVID, there's also not a lot of in-person meetings anymore. That's probably stating the really obvious. But most of my communications with clients were, here's an internet website posting. They can post there. We then have a conversation. Usually what we do is a quick email back and forth for conflict check purposes or so forth, usually with my staff, set up an initial phone call. And then we move from there. So really the answer to the question of what has it done during the COVID is the same thing it would do in any other time, which is it puts me in touch with people who I otherwise have no connection to and almost certainly wouldn't have any relationship that would allow an attorney-client relationship to develop. That's a hills and valleys, like everything else in litigation, hills and valleys. So I can tell you, for example, last year, I was fairly good almost every day taking a peek at the new things that come through. And sometimes you do have to act quickly. That there may be one or two other people in your particular area and your geographic area and your specialization area. And so you monitor those. But there are other times where, let's face it, you're just too busy. You're just too busy. And if you have the good fortune of a new client coming through, you just don't know that you're going to be able to handle that person. And so what I can do is then try and get it to somebody else down the hall, get it to somebody else in the firm who might be able to assist or help that particular client. But I would say if you're actually sitting there paying attention and monitoring, you have the ability to get probably, I would probably say 2 to 3 good clients in a week. And that means monitoring. And a lot of that depends on how many people are actually posting and how many issues are there, because obviously just because someone posts doesn't mean it's a good case or a good client or anything that will develop. But if you really work it, you have the ability to develop a lot. And again, some of them are going to be relatively straightforward, simple matters. We're not talking about career cases. But as I've always told my associates and other folks, I can remember some of my largest cases came from just helping somebody respond to a subpoena, and then that developed from there into a 10-year piece of litigation. And so a lot of that is a lot of this is that. And then the other thing I would add is, again, it increases your internet presence. We attorneys, again, need to adopt technology, need to recognize that consumers of our services look for our services through means that are not traditional. So they're not always asking their financial advisor. They're not always asking, an accountant, who's the attorney I should go to? And we need to adopt that and embrace it. Yeah, that is a great question. I am terrible at analytics, and I need to get better at it. And I need to do a little better job of actually, analyzing the success ratio. What I can tell you is that having tried other programs before, where 1 in 20 developed into anything, and what I found I was doing is spending a half an hour to an hour with constantly fending off, requests or calls or emails or other information. On this, there's a lot more productive discussion. So that's a long way of saying I don't waste my time as much. So if I were to actually hazard a guess of every posting or inquiry that I respond to, how many of those develop into an actual matter, I'd say we're probably looking at about 33%. So I'd say about 1 out of 3. Now, mind you, that's already filtering it down, and it's not necessarily because the other two were bad or weren't going to go anywhere. It may be just because there's an issue, and they just weren't ready to take it to the next level, or it may be because after we explored the issue, there was no reason to move the matter forward. So I would guesstimate of my replies, about 1 in 3 develops into a matter. First off, you can use it probably better than I do. I am not somebody who is very good at using all of the tools that are available, and it's a robust platform. When you see the new cases that are posted, I tend to focus on my left column. What are the new cases that have been posted in the last few days, in the last couple of weeks? What seems good, I'll go in there and look. I'm very good at then taking it to the next level and saying, all right, now I'm going to reply, and you can have stock and standard replies in there. So you don't have to worry about actually typing out an email or doing anything. It fires off. Once you do that reply, it gives you additional options. So now you can see the potential client's name, you can see the potential client's phone number and email. And so now you can, I have developed kind of a process where now I'll reach out personally and guide myself to that individual. What I'm really not good at is some of the other follow-up or additional items. So for example, when I work with my representative for LegalMatch, they're constantly having to clean up my folder because I tend to not go and clean those up very well. And once I've actually made contact with the client, I tend to not keep or track information in the LegalMatch program as much as I can. So it's that platform, and I think that platform makes it unique. You can use it more than I do. I don't know that you can use it too much less than I do, because obviously you have to make those communications. But I could do better with that. Well, especially for a new attorney. Here's what I tell all new attorneys: is as an attorney who's starting out, your first job needs to be to learn the practice of law, particularly when it comes to litigation. I can't speak intelligently on transactional work or anything else. But law school and the real world are two different things. And so your primary goal needs to figure out what you're doing and why, and when it's important and how to do it, and really translate what you've learned in law school to what happens in the real world, to how do you actually solve these problems and prosecute a case or resolve a dispute. There comes a point, however, where you realize, I get it. I don't know when it is. It could be your second or third year. It could be 4 years, 5 years. I don't know. But there's a point where you just kind of lift your head up and you go, I get it. I know where everything kind of fits. I know how this works. I'm now able to kind of say, listen, I've done this before. I have some experience. And at that point, you have to realize that being a lawyer is being a business person, and in a lot of respects, a sole proprietor. You've got to be able to develop your own business. And there are lots of ways of doing that. We all know the traditional ones where you join, charitable boards, where you go to mixers, you join, chambers of commerce, you do those kinds of things. But what we need to do is we need to be able to go out there and try and find other avenues to develop business. LegalMatch is one of those that is easy. And I don't mean it to say that it's overly simplistic and it should be ignored, and it's not important, but it's easy. It's a relatively small cost that ultimately pays for itself. It gives you the ability to screen and scan and interview clients. And again, it puts you directly into contact with people who need legal services, whether they ultimately engage you or not. There are people who need legal services. Here's the short version. We've all learned about the 30-second elevator speech. If you meet somebody and they ask you what you do, you need to be able to explain it while you're in the elevator. I used to joke, I do trial work and litigation. And so if I meet you and you may have business for me, then either you were served sometime in the last 20 days, or you want to sue somebody because you just got wronged. The chances of actually running into somebody in that circumstance is slim. Here, all the people you're talking to, all the people you're introduced to actually fit within that category. They have been wronged. Something has happened, and they are actively looking for legal services. So it puts you in a different area, in a different environment that's easy for you to control, and doesn't take a lot of your time once you figure out how to really operate LegalMatch. I can tell you that the two things that I've really kind of focused on. One of the things is attorneys, we all kind of understand that if you get a cold call, and to some extent these should be treated as cold calls, if you pick up that phone or you answer the phone or you talk to the person, sometimes that conversation turns into a long one where somebody's really trying to get legal advice for free. So you have to be cognizant of that whenever you're involved in any of these online platforms. What I found is through here, once you've responded, once you've made a connection with somebody on LegalMatch, and once you've used your automatic reply, the follow-up, the separate follow-up is important. And usually I do mine by emails, and they're usually customized, personalized emails. So thank you for your LegalMatch inquiry. I understand that you have a case that is about blah. I have experience in this, or we have a department who does that kind of work. And you reach out that way. And then what I do is I make sure that there's a good contact point with somebody in my staff. So I will direct them and say, listen, now that we've established some kind of a contact, and I've demonstrated that we have some interest and some capability in the area or the matter that you have, please contact so-and-so in my office. We'll do the intake to make sure that we have the conflict check taken care of so we can get a little better information on your case, and probably ask for a little bit of documentation. So for example, on a commercial landlord tenant, send us a copy of the lease. That gives us most of the information we need. That way, I can better assess whether or not it's worth moving forward. Is there something that I can do that adds benefit? That second component, is there an ROI that I can provide that's beneficial to the prospective client? And then two, it gives me more information for our initial actual phone or in-person meeting. And I always think that's important, because the more information you have before that initial meeting, the more you can try to start plotting a course with the client, either a course that says, I don't think you have a case, or you do have a case, it's a great case, or you have a case, it's just not the one you think it is, it's different, and here's what I'm thinking and what I'd like to do next. That's always a much more productive conversation. It makes you offensive instead of defensive. I found the other electronic or online lead generation services, you're defensive. Again, you get some kind of a notification, and doggone it, you got to respond, and you got to respond right now. And then when you respond and say, I don't even know what that area of law is that you just said, they pepper back at you again, and then they pepper back at you again, but you got to respond, because if you don't respond, you become terrified of a bad review. Here, you're offensive. They don't know who you are. You don't have to respond. If you don't respond at all to a bunch of these things, they'll never know. They don't know it's you. That sounds like you're hiding, but to some extent, that's what you're doing. If you don't have the ability to respond, if you're busy with something else, if it's not your area, if it's not your kind of a case, you effectively stay concealed. But if it is your kind of a case, if you are looking for work, if you are trying to generate some additional leads, you can go on the offensive and effectively hunt them through the LegalMatch platform.